Hello guys. If you like our content and you love scary stories, then subscribe, like, and write in the comments your scary stories so that we write your story. Scary viewing and terrifying sensations to you. The Haunting of Rosewood Manor. Part 1. A Family's Dark Legacy. The grand Victorian mansion known as Rosewood Manor stood tall and imposing at the edge of a small town, its faded splendor a testament to a bygone era. Built in 1872 by Thomas Wilkins, a wealthy industrialist who had made his fortune in the booming steel industry, the mansion was meant to be a symbol of success and power. With its ornate woodwork, intricate stained glass windows, and sprawling gardens that extended as far as the eye could see, Rosewood Manor was once the jewel of the town. Thomas Wilkins was a man of ambition and pride. He spared no expense in the construction of his dream home, hiring the best architects, artisans, and landscapers to create a residence that would stand the test of time. The manor, with its opulent interiors, grand ballrooms, and luxurious furnishings, quickly became the center of social life. The Wilkins family hosted lavish parties, attended by the most prominent figures in society, and for a time, their lives seemed charmed. However, beneath the surface of this perfect facade, darkness was brewing. In 1885, tragedy struck the Wilkins family when Thomas's beloved wife, Elizabeth, suddenly fell ill. The illness was as mysterious as it was devastating, baffling the doctors who were called to treat her. Elizabeth, once the picture of health and vitality, grew weaker with each passing day. Her once vibrant spirit dimmed, her skin turned ashen, and her eyes lost their sparkle. Despite the best medical care money could buy, Elizabeth's condition worsened, and within months she passed away, leaving Thomas heartbroken and inconsolable. Elizabeth's death marked the beginning of a series of misfortunes that would plague the Wilkins family for years to come. Shortly after her passing, strange occurrences began to take place within the mansion. Servants reported hearing Elizabeth's voice calling out in the night, and on more than one occasion, Thomas claimed to have seen her ghostly figure wandering the halls, her expression sorrowful and lost. As the years went by, the Wilkins family's luck continued to decline. Thomas's children, who had once been the pride and joy of the family, died young under suspicious circumstances. His eldest son, William, was found dead in his bed one morning, his face contorted in terror as if he had been scared to death. His daughter, Margaret, drowned in the estate's pond, though she was known to be an excellent swimmer. The deaths of his children left Thomas a broken man, and the once thriving estate began to crumble around him. By the turn of the century, the Wilkins family had all but vanished. Thomas, now a shell of the man he once was, retreated into solitude, rarely leaving the confines of his mansion. The servants left one by one, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the house. The local townspeople began to avoid the mansion, whispering that it was cursed and that the land itself was tainted by dark forces. Rosewood Manor, once a beacon of prosperity, had become a place of death and despair. The mansion stood abandoned for decades, its once majestic facade now weathered and decaying. Weeds overtook the gardens, the windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in ivy. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones of the tragedies that had befallen the Wilkins family and warned outsiders to stay away from the cursed house. But despite its dilapidated state, Rosewood Manor still held a certain allure. There was something about the mansion that drew people in, as if the house itself was alive and waiting for new victims to claim. And so, in 1974, when a young couple named John and Sarah Matthews purchased the property, they had no idea of the horrors that awaited them. Part 2. A New Beginning. When John and Sarah Matthews first laid eyes on Rosewood Manor, they were immediately captivated by its faded beauty. The couple had always dreamed of restoring an old, historic home, and the manor, with its rich history and grand architecture, seemed like the perfect project. Despite the warnings from the locals about the house's dark past, the Matthews were undeterred. They saw potential in the mansion's crumbling walls and overgrown gardens and were determined to breathe new life into the once glorious estate. With their 2 young children, Emily and Michael, in tow, the Matthews family moved into Rosewood Manor, eager to begin their renovations. They were a close-knit family, full of hope and excitement about the future. John, an architect by trade, was particularly enthusiastic about the project, drawing up detailed plans to restore the mansion to its former glory. Sarah, a talented interior designer, envisioned transforming the dilapidated rooms into warm, welcoming spaces where they could build a lifetime of memories. For the first few months, everything seemed to be going according to plan. The renovations were progressing smoothly, and the family settled into their new life with enthusiasm. They spent their days working on the house and their evenings exploring the expansive grounds where the children loved to play among the old trees and wildflowers. But as they spent more time in the house, the family began to notice odd occurrences that they couldn't easily explain. Doors would creak open on their own, lights flickered without reason, and cold drafts blew through rooms that had no windows. At first, they dismissed these incidents as quirks of an old house, settling noises, faulty wiring, and drafts that could be easily fixed. However, the oddities grew more frequent and more difficult to ignore. Sarah often felt as if she were being watched, especially when she was alone in the house. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The sensation of being observed became so strong that she found herself looking over her shoulder constantly, her nerves on edge. The children, too, began to exhibit signs of unease. Emily, who had always been a happy and outgoing child, became withdrawn and quiet. She started to have nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming about shadow people in her room. When John and Sarah would rush to her side, they found her trembling and pale, unable to describe what she had seen, only that it was something dark and terrifying. Michael, the younger of the 2 children, was normally fearless and full of energy, but even he seemed affected by the strange atmosphere in the house. He started to sleepwalk, something he had never done before. On more than one occasion, John and Sarah found him wandering the halls in the middle of the night, his eyes wide open but unseeing. When they tried to wake him, he would stare at them blankly before bursting into tears, unable to remember what had happened. John, who had always been skeptical of anything supernatural, was initially dismissive of the strange occurrences. He rationalized everything, insisting that it was just the house settling or the result of overactive imaginations. But as the days turned into weeks, even he couldn't deny that something was wrong. Late one night, while working in his study, John experienced something that shook his skepticism to its core. As he was going over blueprints for the next phase of renovations, he heard a soft, disembodied voice whispering his name. The sound seemed to come from directly behind him, but when he turned around, the room was empty. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature in the room plummeted. He felt a cold, clammy hand brush the back of his neck, sending a shiver of terror down his spine. In that moment, he knew that something was very wrong with Rosewood Manor. Part 3. The Unseen Presence. The unsettling events at Rosewood Manor grew increasingly frequent and more terrifying with each passing day. The once welcoming atmosphere of the house turned dark and oppressive, and the family began to feel as if they were living in a waking nightmare. The entity that haunted the mansion, which had initially made its presence known through subtle means, became increasingly aggressive, as if feeding off the family's fear. Objects in the house began to move on their own, sometimes with such force that they would shatter or fly across the room. Books would fall off shelves, pictures would tilt or fall from the walls, and furniture would shift slightly when no one was around. The most disturbing incidents involved the children's toys. Emily's dolls, which she used to adore, now terrified her. She would find them in places she hadn't left them, their eyes seeming to follow her wherever she went. Michael's toy cars would roll across the floor by themselves, stopping abruptly at his feet, as if someone or something had pushed them. The family's pets, a dog named Max and a cat named Whiskers, were also affected by the haunting. Max, a normally friendly and playful dog, began to growl at empty corners of the room, his hackles raised and his eyes fixed on something only he could see. Whiskers, who had always been aloof but calm, became skittish and would hiss and arch her back at seemingly nothing. The animal's behavior only added to the growing sense of unease within the house. The most terrifying experiences, however, were those involving the children. Emily and Michael both began to speak of a lady in white who would appear in their room at night, standing silently by their beds. They described her as a sad-looking woman with long dark hair and a pale face, dressed in a flowing white gown. Despite her sorrowful appearance, there was something menacing about her presence, and the children were terrified of her. Emily, in particular, seemed to be targeted by the entity. She would often wake up in the middle of the night screaming, claiming that the lady in white was trying to take her away. On several occasions, John and Sarah found Emily standing at the foot of her bed, staring blankly at the wall, as if in a trance. When they would shake her awake, she would burst into tears, unable to explain what had happened. The final straw came one night when Sarah was alone in the house with the children. John had gone out to pick up some supplies for the renovation, and Sarah was putting the children to bed. As she tucked Emily in, she noticed that the room had grown unnaturally cold. The windows were shut, and there was no draft, but the temperature continued to drop until she could see her breath in the air. Suddenly, the door to Emily's room slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the lights flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it shut from the other side. Emily began to scream, and Sarah could hear Michael crying in his room down the hall. She pounded on the door, calling for John, even though she knew he wasn't there. Then, out of the darkness, she saw a figure standing at the foot of Emily's bed. The lady in white, her face pale and eyes hollow, was staring directly at Sarah. There was a look of deep sorrow in her eyes, but also a hint of malice. Sarah felt a cold hand brush against her cheek, and she recoiled in terror. In that moment, she knew that whatever was haunting Rosewood Manor was not just a restless spirit, it was something far more malevolent. As suddenly as it had begun, the lights flickered back on, and the door to Emily's room creaked open. The figure was gone, and the temperature returned to normal, but the fear remained. Shaken and terrified, Sarah gathered the children and fled the house, driving to the nearest motel where they spent the night. When John returned home and found the house empty, he knew something was terribly wrong. He drove to the motel and found Sarah and the children huddled together, still shaken from their ordeal. Sarah recounted what had happened, and for the first time, John admitted that they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. Part 4. Seeking help. Desperate for answers, John and Sarah began to research the history of Rosewood Manor, hoping to uncover something that could explain the terrifying events that were plaguing their family. They spent countless hours poring over old newspaper articles, historical records, and local legends, trying to piece together the puzzle of the house's dark past. They learned that the mansion had a long history of tragedy and death, stretching back to its construction in the late 19th century. The original owner, Thomas Wilkins, had built the house for his beloved wife, Elizabeth, but she had died under mysterious circumstances shortly after moving in. The death of his children followed, and the once thriving estate had fallen into disrepair as the Wilkins family's fortunes declined. But the tragedies didn't end with the Wilkins family. Over the years, Rosewood Manor had changed hands several times, and each new owner seemed to meet with a similar fate. There were reports of strange illnesses, accidents, and unexplained deaths among those who lived in the house. One owner, a reclusive artist, had been found dead in his studio, his body twisted in a grotesque position as if he had died in agony. Another, a wealthy businessman, had hanged himself in the grand staircase, leaving behind a note that simply read, "She won't let me go." The more they learned, the more John and Sarah became convinced that the house was cursed, and that the entity haunting it was not just a ghost, but something far more sinister. They began to fear for their children's safety, knowing that the entity seemed to be targeting them specifically. Realizing that they couldn't handle the situation on their own, John and Sarah decided to seek help from a paranormal investigator. They reached out to Dr. Eleanor Harper, a renowned expert in the field of paranormal activity, who had gained a reputation for solving some of the most difficult and dangerous cases of hauntings. Dr. Harper agreed to take on the case and traveled to Rosewood Manor to meet with the Matthews family. She was a calm and composed woman in her late 40s, with a sharp mind and a deep understanding of the supernatural. She had seen many haunted houses in her career, but there was something about Rosewood Manor that unsettled even her. Upon arriving at the house, Dr. Harper immediately sensed the presence of something dark and malevolent. The air was thick with negative energy, and the house itself seemed to exude a feeling of dread. As she walked through the rooms, she could feel the entity watching her, its presence heavy and oppressive. Dr. Harper conducted a thorough investigation, using a variety of tools and techniques to gather evidence of the haunting. She recorded electronic voice phenomena (EVP) sessions, capturing faint whispers and disembodied voices that seemed to echo from the walls. She used thermal imaging cameras to detect cold spots and anomalies in the temperature, and she set up motion sensors to track any unexplained movement within the house. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that concerned Dr. Harper. As she delved deeper into the history of the house, she began to uncover disturbing patterns. The deaths that had occurred in Rosewood Manor were not random. They seemed to follow a specific pattern, with each victim experiencing the same symptoms of fear and despair before meeting their untimely end. It was as if the entity was feeding off their fear, growing stronger with each life it claimed. Dr. Harper also discovered something even more chilling: a series of handwritten notes hidden in the attic, left behind by Thomas Wilkins himself. The notes were filled with ramblings about dark rituals and ancient curses, along with sketches of strange symbols and sigils. It became clear that Thomas had been dabbling in something far beyond his understanding, and that the entity haunting Rosewood Manor was the result of these forbidden practices. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Dr. Harper knew that the only way to protect the Matthews family was to perform a cleansing ritual to banish the entity from the house. But she also knew that this would be no ordinary exorcism. The entity was powerful, and it would not go down without a fight. Part 5. Preparing for the ritual. Dr. Harper's discovery of the notes left by Thomas Wilkins confirmed her worst fears. The entity haunting Rosewood Manor was not just a restless spirit, it was something far more ancient and malevolent, bound to the land by dark rituals performed long ago. To banish it, she would need to perform a powerful cleansing ritual, one that would require immense concentration and strength. The first step in preparing for the ritual was to gather the necessary materials. Dr. Harper explained to John and Sarah that they would need items imbued with spiritual power to protect themselves and drive the entity out. These included holy water, blessed candles, protective charms, and herbs known for their cleansing properties. They also needed to find a way to draw the entity out into the open, where it could be confronted and banished. John and Sarah, though terrified, were determined to do whatever it took to protect their family. They followed Dr. Harper's instructions to the letter, procuring the necessary items and preparing the house for the ritual. They removed all mirrors and reflective surfaces, as these could serve as portals for the entity to escape or draw power from. They also cleared the rooms of any personal belongings, as the entity could use these to form a connection with the family members. The night before the ritual, Dr. Harper gathered the Matthews family in the living room and explained what they could expect. The ritual would be conducted at midnight, the hour when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. They would start in the attic, the heart of the house's darkness, and work their way down through the floors, cleansing each room as they went. The final confrontation would take place in the basement, where the entity's power was strongest. Dr. Harper warned the family that the entity would not go down without a fight. It would try to intimidate them, to break their resolve and make them abandon the ritual. It would use their worst fears against them, manifesting in ways that would test their courage and faith. But if they stood strong and kept their focus, they could drive it out and free the house from its curse. The tension in the house was palpable as midnight approached. The air seemed to grow heavier, the shadows darker, as if the house itself was aware of what was about to happen. The children were especially frightened, clinging to their parents as they prepared for the ritual. Emily, in particular, was terrified of seeing the lady in white again, but Dr. Harper reassured her that they were going to make the spirit go away for good. As the clock struck midnight, the ritual began. Dr. Harper led the way, holding a candle blessed by a priest, while John carried a vial of holy water and Sarah held a bundle of protective herbs. They climbed the stairs to the attic, where the temperature dropped sharply and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. It was as if the house was alive, watching their every move. In the attic, Dr. Harper began chanting the words of an ancient cleansing prayer, her voice steady and clear despite the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the room. She sprinkled holy water in the corners, drawing protective symbols on the floor with chalk. The candle's flame flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but it did not go out a sign that the ritual was working. As they moved from room to room, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The entity began to manifest, first as faint whispers and distant footsteps, then as more tangible forms. They saw fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures, heard the sound of children's laughter mixed with sobs, and felt the icy touch of unseen hands brushing against their skin. But they pressed on, reciting the prayers and sprinkling holy water, determined to see the ritual through. When they reached the basement, the heart of the entity's power, the atmosphere became almost unbearable. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, and the air was so thick with malevolence that it was difficult to breathe. The temperature plummeted, and the lights began to flicker wildly, casting the room in an otherworldly glow. Suddenly, the entity made its final, desperate move. It manifested in front of them, taking the form of the lady in white, her face twisted in a grotesque mask of sorrow and rage. She let out a blood-curdling scream, the sound so intense that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Emily screamed in terror, clinging to Sarah as the entity advanced toward them. But Dr. Harper stood her ground, raising the blessed candle high and chanting the final words of the cleansing ritual. The flame burned brighter, filling the room with a blinding light that seemed to push back the darkness. The entity shrieked in agony, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows before vanishing entirely. As the last words of the ritual echoed through the room, the oppressive energy lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and calm. The lights stopped flickering, the temperature returned to normal, and the house fell silent. The entity was gone, banished from Rosewood Manor once and for all. Part 6. The Aftermath. The morning after the ritual, the Matthews family awoke to a house that felt strangely different. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Rosewood Manor for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of tranquility and peace. The air was lighter, the rooms brighter, and even the garden seemed to be more vibrant, as if the house itself had been freed from a dark curse. Dr. Harper stayed with the family for a few days after the ritual to ensure that the entity was truly gone and that there were no lingering effects. She performed a final cleansing of the house, using incense and blessed water to seal the protective symbols she had drawn during the ritual. She also left behind several protective charms for the family to place around the house, just in case the entity tried to return. As the days passed, the family began to relax and settle back into their lives. The children, who had been so traumatized by the haunting, started to sleep peacefully through the night, no longer plagued by nightmares or visits from the lady in white. John and Sarah, who had been so tense and on edge, found themselves laughing and enjoying each other's company again, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. But even as they tried to move on from the ordeal, there were subtle reminders of what they had been through. The house, though no longer haunted, still bore the scars of its dark past. There were rooms that the family avoided, places that still felt cold and empty despite the cleansing. The basement, in particular, was a place they rarely ventured into, the memories of the final confrontation with the entity still too fresh in their minds. Emily and Michael, though no longer seeing the lady in white, were still hesitant to talk about what had happened. They had experienced things that no child should ever have to go through, and it would take time for them to fully recover. Sarah, too, found herself struggling with the memories of that terrifying night. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of the lady in white standing at the foot of her bed. John, who had always been the skeptic, was perhaps the most changed by the experience. He had been forced to confront something that defied all rational explanation, something that had shaken his very belief system to its core. He found himself questioning everything he had once taken for granted, wondering how many other things in the world were beyond human understanding. Despite the lingering effects of the haunting, the family was grateful to be free of the entity that had tormented them for so long. They knew that they had come dangerously close to losing everything, and they were determined to make the most of their second chance. They continued with the renovations, slowly restoring Rosewood Manor to its former glory, but with a newfound respect for the history and spirits of the house. Dr. Harper remained in contact with the family, checking in periodically to see how they were doing. She was relieved to hear that the entity had not returned and that the house seemed to be at peace. But she also knew that the darkness that had haunted Rosewood Manor was ancient and powerful, and that there was always a chance that it could find its way back. Before she left, Dr. Harper gave the family one final piece of advice: to always be vigilant and to respect the house's history. Rosewood Manor was no ordinary home, and its past would always be a part of it. As long as they respected that, she believed that the house would remain a safe and peaceful place for them to live. The family took her advice to heart, and over time, the fear and trauma they had experienced began to fade. The house became a home once more, filled with laughter, love, and the memories of a family that had survived the unimaginable. But deep down, they all knew that the shadow of Rosewood Manor's dark past would never fully disappear. It would always be a part of their lives, a reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead. Part 7. The Unseen Force. Months passed, and the Matthews family had started to believe that the horrors of Rosewood Manor were behind them. The renovations were nearly complete, and the house had been transformed from a decaying relic into a beautiful, vibrant home. The children had returned to their normal routines, playing happily in the garden and attending school without fear. John and Sarah, too, had begun to find peace, their lives returning to a semblance of normalcy. But just as they were beginning to feel secure, strange things started happening again. It began subtly. Small objects like keys or toys would go missing, only to be found later in places where no one had put them. The family initially dismissed these incidents as forgetfulness or accidents, not wanting to believe that the entity had returned. But as the occurrences grew more frequent and more disturbing, it became harder to ignore. One night, John was working late in his study when he felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment he thought he saw a shadow pass by the doorway. He called out, thinking it was Sarah or one of the children, but there was no response. When he got up to investigate, he found the hallway empty and silent. Sarah, too, began to experience strange phenomena. She would often hear faint whispers coming from the walls, voices that seemed to be calling her name. At first, she thought it was just the wind or the creaking of the old house, but the whispers grew louder and more insistent. One evening, while she was alone in the kitchen, she felt a cold hand brush against her arm, sending a shiver of fear down her spine. When she turned around, no one was there. The children, who had been so happy and carefree in the months following the cleansing ritual, began to change as well. Emily, who had been sleeping peacefully, started having nightmares again. She would wake up crying, saying that the lady in white had returned and was standing at the foot of her bed. Michael, who had once loved playing outside, refused to go near the garden, saying that he felt like someone was watching him from the windows. The final straw came when Sarah discovered a series of strange symbols etched into the walls of the basement. The symbols were similar to the ones Dr. Harper had found in Thomas Wilkins' notes, and they radiated a dark, malevolent energy. Sarah immediately called Dr. Harper, fearing that the entity had returned to Rosewood Manor. Dr. Harper arrived the next day, and as soon as she entered the house, she could sense that something was terribly wrong. The protective charm she had left behind had been disturbed, and the air was thick with negative energy. She inspected the symbols in the basement and confirmed Sarah's worst fears: the entity had indeed returned, and it was stronger than ever. Dr. Harper explained that the entity had likely been weakened by the cleansing ritual but not completely banished. It had gone into hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The symbols in the basement were a sign that it was trying to regain its power, drawing on the dark energy that had been bound to the house for so many years. Realizing that they were in grave danger, Dr. Harper decided to perform another, more powerful ritual to banish the entity once and for all. But she warned the family that this would be their last chance. If the ritual failed, the entity would grow even stronger, and they might not survive another encounter. The family, terrified but determined, agreed to go through with the ritual. They knew that their lives depended on it, and that they could not continue living in fear. Dr. Harper began preparing for the ritual, gathering the necessary materials and drawing up plans for the final confrontation with the unseen force that had haunted Rosewood Manor for so long. Part 8: The Final Confrontation. The night of the final ritual was one of the darkest the Matthews family had ever experienced. The sky was overcast, and a heavy rain pounded against the windows of Rosewood Manor, as if the elements themselves were warning them of the danger that lay ahead. The air inside the house was thick with tension, and every creak and groan of the old building seemed amplified, echoing through the empty rooms like the footsteps of some unseen intruder. Dr. Harper had instructed the family to stay together in the living room while she prepared the basement for the ritual. She had set up protective wards around the house, using the symbols and charms she had brought with her, and had drawn a large circle of salt in the center of the basement to serve as a barrier against the entity. Inside the circle, she placed candles, crystals, and other items of spiritual significance, all intended to strengthen the ritual's power. As the hour of midnight approached, Dr. Harper called the family down to the basement. The children were visibly frightened, clinging to their parents as they descended the creaky wooden stairs into the dimly lit room. The basement, once a place of fear and darkness, now felt strangely serene, as if the ritual preparations had driven away some of the malevolent energy that had long permeated the space. Dr. Harper instructed the family to stand inside the circle of salt, holding hands to form a protective barrier. She took her place at the center of the circle, holding a bundle of sage in one hand and a vial of holy water in the other. As she began to chant the words of the ritual, the candles flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. At first, nothing happened. The air was still, the room silent save for the sound of Dr. Harper's voice. But as she continued the ritual, A low, rumbling noise began to emanate from the walls, growing louder with each passing moment. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the lights began to flicker, casting the room into an eerie half-darkness. Suddenly, the entity made its presence known. A shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the salt circle, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of smoke. The figure had no discernible features, but its presence was palpable, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to radiate pure hatred. The children screamed and clung to their parents as the figure loomed closer, its shadowy tendrils reaching out toward the circle. Dr. Harper raised the vial of holy water and began to sprinkle it around the perimeter of the circle, chanting louder and more forcefully. The figure recoiled, hissing like a snake as the holy water made contact with its form. But it did not retreat. Instead, it pressed forward, its shadowy form growing larger and more solid with each passing moment. John and Sarah, their fear mounting, tightened their grip on their children's hands, trying to shield them from the terrifying sight. But the entity was relentless, pushing against the barrier of the salt circle, as if testing its strength. The candles flickered wildly, and the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the walls closing in as the entity's presence grew stronger. Dr. Harper, realizing that the ritual alone might not be enough to banish the entity, reached into her bag and pulled out a small, intricately carved box. She opened it to reveal a crystal, glowing with a soft, ethereal light. The crystal was a powerful talisman, one that she had only used in the most dire of circumstances. It had the ability to trap and contain malevolent spirits, but using it came with great risk. If the entity was too powerful, the crystal could shatter, releasing the spirit and leaving them with no means of defense. With no other options, Dr. Harper placed the crystal at the center of the salt circle and began to chant a different incantation, one designed to draw the entity into the crystal's confines. The entity, sensing the change, let out a deafening roar, its shadowy form thrashing wildly as it fought against the pull of the crystal's energy. The room shook as the entity's power clashed with the crystal's, the air crackling with electricity. The figure grew more solid, its form becoming clearer as it struggled to break free. But the crystal's light grew brighter, intensifying until it filled the entire room with a blinding brilliance. The entity let out one final, anguished scream as it was pulled into the crystal, its shadowy form twisting and contorting before disappearing entirely. As the light faded and the room returned to darkness, the Matthews family stood in stunned silence, the only sound the heavy breathing of Dr. Harper as she collapsed to her knees, exhausted from the effort. The crystal, now containing the entity, glowed faintly in the center of the circle, a sign that the spirit had been successfully trapped. The house was silent, the oppressive energy that had once filled it now gone. The family, still shaken but relieved, slowly began to release their grip on each other, taking in the reality of what had just happened. Dr. Harper, though weary, managed a weak smile as she assured them that the entity was gone for good. Part 9: A New Beginning. In the weeks that followed the final confrontation, the Matthews family slowly began to rebuild their lives. The house, once a place of fear and darkness, now felt like a true home. The oppressive energy that had once permeated every corner of Rosewood Manor was gone, replaced by a sense of peace and tranquility. Dr. Harper had taken the crystal containing the trapped entity with her, ensuring that it would be safely stored away in a place where it could never harm anyone again. She had advised the family to keep the protective charms and symbols in place as a precaution against any lingering malevolent forces. But she was confident that the entity had been banished for good and that the house was now safe. The family began to settle into their new life, enjoying the peace and quiet of their home. The children, who had once been so terrified, were now able to sleep peacefully through the night. Emily, who had been haunted by the lady in white, no longer had nightmares, and Michael, who had feared the garden, was now happy to play outside once again. John and Sarah, too, found a new sense of peace. They had been through an ordeal that had tested their strength and their faith, but they had come out of it stronger than ever. The experience had brought them closer together, and they were determined to make the most of their second chance at happiness. As the renovations were completed, the house transformed into a beautiful, welcoming home. The once dark and dreary rooms were now filled with light and warmth, a testament to the family's resilience and determination. The garden, once overgrown and neglected, had been restored to its former glory, with vibrant flowers and lush greenery filling the space. The family hosted a small gathering to celebrate the completion of the renovations and to thank those who had helped them through their ordeal. Dr. Harper was a guest of honor, and the family expressed their deep gratitude for her bravery and expertise in saving them from the entity that had haunted their home. As the night drew to a close, the family gathered in the living room, reflecting on the journey they had been through. They knew that they had been given a second chance, and they were determined to make the most of it. Rosewood Manor, once a place of fear and despair, had become a symbol of their strength and resilience, a place where they could build new memories and find happiness. But even as they looked to the future with hope and optimism, they knew that they would never forget the events that had transpired within the walls of their home. The shadow of Rosewood Manor's dark past would always be a part of their lives, a reminder of the thin line between the living and the dead, and the unseen forces that exist in the world. And as they sat together, watching the flickering flames of the fireplace, they couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, as if the house itself was watching them, waiting and listening. The entity may have been banished, but the house had seen too much, experienced too much to ever be truly at peace. The end. Or is it?